As the country observes 16 days of activism against the abuse of women and children, activists and civil society groups have stressed the need for an open dialogue around restorative justice. As it stands, the option for restorative justice, especially in intimate partner violence, seems least favoured by victims of GBV. We discuss what this process entails and whether it adequately serves its purpose with Director at the Restorative Justice Centre, Mike Batley. Mr. Batley, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. Perhaps let's just begin with you explaining what restorative justice is and how it differs from traditional punitive justice systems.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, Katlego. Restorative justice is an approach to justice that emphasizes repair and healing and making right, as opposed to just simple punishment. I'd like to emphasize that it's not about being a softer form of justice. I think that the law is a very blunt instrument, and we know that punishment in itself is really not effective. So restorative justice focuses on the harm that people have suffered. It focuses on the victims and their needs, but then it also creates opportunities for offenders to be held accountable in constructive ways. So I think in a nutshell, that's what it would be about. And let me then also say, we talk about restorative justice processes, various ways in which we can bring parties, everybody who's been affected by a crime incident together. And that can be done at any stage of the process. So it can be done as an alternative to crime, it can be done as part of the sentencing stage, or it can be done post-sentence, for example, when somebody is about to go on parole. So I think that would be a thumbnail sketch of what restorative justice entails.
So maybe just expanding on that thumbnail sketch, how has the concept of restorative justice been applied, particularly in South Africa, in the context of GBV?
So at the Restorative Justice Centre, we've been doing it for many years, with a specific focus on gender-based violence the last 4 or 5 years, but certainly prior to that as well. If viewers are interested, they can look on our website, rjc.co.za. Under the resources page, there are 2 evaluation reports there where external people have engaged with both the victims and the perpetrators and got their views about how effective it was for them. It remains controversial. I think people are afraid that it is being soft, that it's letting people off the hook. And as I said just now, it's certainly not intended to be that at all. But I think there are more legitimate concerns as well as to whether it could pose a safety risk to victims, whether it could actually feed into the dynamics of the whole abusive cycle. But as a restorative justice advocate and practitioner, I think that those can be well managed.
You speak of this process not to be seen as a softer form of justice, and I can believe that it's a process that involves both the victim as well as the perpetrator. In the instance where the victim is no longer alive, how does that process work?
Well, then it would be with the other people who've been affected, other family members who would maybe like to ask the offender some questions, maybe tell them how they have been impacted by the incident. But I must stress that it's always voluntary. It's not something that can be forced on anybody for whatever reason. So it's always voluntary for perpetrators as well as victims and other stakeholders.
What challenges do you believe the system currently is facing in ensuring that restorative justice practices, especially in GBV cases, are attained in the way that they should?
Well, I think that in many ways there is a lot of openness to this. So certainly in the referrals that we get from the Pretoria Magistrates Court, there's great openness to that, and we've been working with the probation officers and the prosecutors there for a number of years very closely. I think the obstacles to expanding that are a shared understanding. Some people are simply dead against it, but then also the resourcing, the funding for particularly civil society organizations to develop good practice to actually do this. So that's the main fundamental obstacle. I think if there was a more dedicated plan to extending restorative justice services, then better structures and systems and good practice could be developed.
And do you find that it's always achievable, where perpetrators are rehabilitators and those that needed the justice are in a conciliatory type of a way in which they now relate to the perpetrator?
As I said, it's a voluntary process. So when we get a referral, we engage the parties individually first and explain to them what it's about, and then they have the choice whether they want to continue or not. And most couples do continue. I think in the last batch of referrals that we've dealt with this year, literally only 1 or 2 out of over 30 cases would have chosen not to go ahead with the process. That doesn't mean that there's always reconciliation. So a process like this, a meeting like this, is an opportunity for parties to reset. They can evaluate where their relationship stands and say, okay, this violent incident has happened. There was a build-up to that. There's a whole context to that. Where do we want to go now? Do we want to continue working and investing in this relationship, or do we want to choose to go separately? So as facilitators and mediators, it's not our position or not our place to influence that in any way, but to help the parties communicate well about that and make their decisions, their own decisions about that. So, but certainly many parties do choose to continue, and then they would invest in things like counselling, other forms of healing, like couple counselling or trauma debriefing. And we also offer a program around non-violent communication skills. So there's an opportunity to, learn how to communicate more effectively. So it really is an opportunity for a relationship to be reset and to grow and to move in a different direction. And certainly that seems to be true for many of the couples that we've engaged with over the last 4 or 5 years.
And just speaking about the engagement that you do on relationships, is it limited to intimate couples? Because you find many instances where there is a lot of conflict within the household between children and grandparents or parents and children. Do you also mediate? And what's the process within those kind of relationships?
Yeah, well, all of those would be included so that's not intimate partner violence, but would be included in gender-based violence. And certainly the process would be very similar. So that some of the dynamics would be different, but the process of engaging the parties individually first, explaining what it's about, and then facilitating this engagement, this encounter, would be very similar. And we can do that with any party, so certainly with the whole household.
So lastly, Mr. Batley, just from your experience, how do you believe this type of justice can contribute to the long-term solutions of GBV, especially in South Africa?
Well, I think it really creates an opportunity for people to reflect on their own roles, their own behavior, and rather than being destructive and destroying families, it's an investment in helping couples work out their own issues, their own conflict, understanding the reasons for that, and the possibility of building and strengthening relationships. So in that sense, it's the most amazing opportunity to invest in family life and strengthening those relationships, as the family is the building block of society.
Most certainly. Mr. Batley, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. That's Mike Batley, the director at Restorative Justice Centre, speaking to us there on the back of 16 Days of Activism and the different ways in that people can get justice from incidents of GBV.